Peace and blessings, and don't you dare go testing. It's the Gizai, always the Get Flizzai, the Wizai, decking the boy Izai, Tizai, destined to get the Windsors, Finses, clearing up all the lenses. One path is the way that I'm taking, getting closer to God in a tight situation now. It's part two to the document, the exemption. We'll be going over that for you now. And we stopped at title to property. Title to property. We have alluded to the fact that other items were donated to the public to serve as collateral for the U.S. bankruptcy. The quote from the congressional record indicates that all the homes and other property of all the people in the nation would be mortgaged. Beginning in 1933 or earlier, a system was set up to accomplish this objective. To understand this concept, we will have to explore the meaning of the word title. To accomplish this, we will examine various kinds of title. Title, real property title. Title is the means whereby the owner of lands or any other tangible assets, such as a car, has the just possession of his property, the union of all the elements which constitute ownership, full independent and fee ownership, the right to or ownership in land, also the evidence of such ownership. Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition. Absolute title, as applied to title to land, an exclusive title, or at least a title which excludes all others not compatible with it. An absolute title to land cannot exist at the same time in different persons or in different governments. This suggests that various aspects of title can be held by different parties. See also fee simple, Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition. Fee simple, absolute, a fee simple absolute estate limited absolutely to a man and his heirs and assigns forever without limitation or condition. An absolute or fee simple estate is one in which the owner is entitled to the entire property with unconditional power of disposition during his life and descending to his heirs and legal representatives upon his death and estate. Such estate is unlimited as to duration, disposition, and descendability. Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition. A term which is very similar to fee simple is allodium. Allodium, land held absolutely in one's own right and not of any lord or superior, land not subject to feudal duties or burdens, and estate held by absolute ownership without recognizing any superior to whom any duties is due on account thereof. Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition. From the above definitions, we see that there are multiple elements which constitute ownership. Title can be divided into two distinct parts: equitable title and legal title. Legal title, one cognizable and enforceable in a court of law, or on which is complete and perfect so far as regards the parent right of ownership and possession, but which carries no beneficial interest in the property, another person being equitably entitled thereto. In either case, the antithesis of equitable title. Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition. Equitable title, a right to the party to whom it belongs to have the legal title transferred to him, or the beneficial interest of one person whom equity regards as the real owner, although the legal title is vested in another. See also equitable ownership, Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition. Equitable ownership, the ownership interest of one who has equitable as contrasted with legal ownership of property, as in the case of a trust beneficiary. Ownership rights which are protected in equity. See also equitable interest, Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition. Equitable, the interest of a beneficiary under a trust is considered equitable as contrasted with the interest of the trustee, which is a legal interest because the trustee has legal as contrasted with equitable title. Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition. The above definitions make it clear that the right to property is divided between equitable and legal title. The legal title portion is the right of possession, but which carries no beneficial interest in the property. The equitable title portion carries the beneficial interest portion of the title. Based upon these definitions, we would suggest that when we buy property, we are only given the legal title and therefore only have the right of possession. This means when we buy land and a house, we can live on the land and in the house. But we suggest that the county where it exists and is registered acts as the trustee to hold the equitable title or beneficial interest for the beneficiaries, the people. The county is the trustee over the equitable interest, and we pay trustee fees to the county in the form of property taxes. One who holds property as fee simple or in allodium will pay no property taxes. In the early 1900s, virtually all property was held in allodium and no property taxes were paid. We would suggest that these same principles of title apply to virtually all other things of value. We hold the right of possession, and the government at some level, county, state, federal, acts as trustee to hold the equitable interest. In the article about the straw man, we saw that your birth certificate is registered when you are born. This means the government holds title to your straw man's name. When you get married, you get a marriage license that is registered with the state. Some have suggested that this gives the state trusteeship over the equitable interest in the fruit of the marriage, the children. That is why the state, through Child Protective Services, can take your children whenever they deem it appropriate. When you buy a car, the title is registered to the state. We pay trustee fees to the state every year in the form of license plate fees. So we see that the government as trustees hold equitable interest in your forefathers' gold, your home, your children, and your cars. This leads us to ask a critical question. What were we given in exchange for all of these assets? Our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents were given paper money for their gold, but this was not an exchange. The gold had real value, but the paper money was worthless. The government needed the gold and your other assets as collateral against their bankruptcy. But what have we, the people, been given in exchange for all of these things? We will certainly do something of substance. We will suggest that we, the people, have been placed in a position of being the creditors to the government. We are owed a huge debt because the government has used our property and substance to help with their bankruptcy. We have been duped into believing that we are responsible to repay the national debt, but we have in fact been the surety for the debt. The following quote sheds some light on the idea of a debtor. Debt is our principal's and surety. The principal debtor is bound as between him and his surety to pay the whole debt, and if the surety pay it, he will be entitled to recover against the principal. Bouvier's Law Dictionary, 1856. This quote indicates that there's a difference between the principal debtor, the government, and the surety, the people. It plainly says that the principal debtor is responsible to pay back the debt. But if we as a surety do pay the debt, the surety is entitled to recover the cost from the debtor. We have been paying the debt with our property, our labor, and our taxes. We are owed a great deal. Another way of looking at our monetary system is to say that everything in our society is prepaid. All money is backed by the people and their property. Without us, there will be no money in our current system. Everything in society has been paid for at the manufacturing level with the money that was created from us and our property. Therefore, everything in existence in our society is an extension of what we are owed, and therefore everything is prepaid by us and for us. How much are we owed for all that we have given? One way to answer this is to see how much money was created from each of us. One person tried to find the answer to this question by sending a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request. This person asked how much money had been created from his or her Social Security number. A letter was returned explaining that the government could not provide a full list of the Federal Reserve notes that had been created from the Social Security number unless the person was willing to send them $2,800 at 10 cents a page to provide a copying cost. This means there were a total of 28,000 pages. A few pages were attached to the letter that listed Federal Reserve note serial numbers and value of each note. Based upon this information, let's see if we can create a model to estimate the amount of money this 28,000 pages will represent. Let's assume that each page contained 2 columns of note numbers and denominations, and that there were 2 columns per page, a total of 60 notes per page. Let's further assume that there is an even distribution of the following note denominations, evenly distributed across all the pages: 1, 5, 10, 20, 50, and 100. This would mean that 280,000 notes of each denomination will be listed. These assumptions would yield a total of $52,080,000. This is just an estimate, but it should give you some idea that the government has created an enormous amount of money from each of us. The exemption, what we are owed. What do we get in exchange for all that has been created from us? We will suggest that what the people are owed is manifest in 2 ways. The people are beneficiaries in the trust, and the people have been given an exemption. In the broadest terms, we call what is owed us an exemption. Exemption, freedom from a general duty or service, immunity from a general burden, tax, or charge, immunity from certain legal obligations. Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition. We have been given an exemption for having to pay our debts. We now have the ability to discharge our debts. Do you suppose there is a way to use this exemption to discharge our debts by accessing what is owed to us and held in trust? We believe this is quite possible. To begin to understand how we might access this exemption, we need to look at various forms of payment. We already know that all the coins and currencies of the United States, including Federal Reserve notes, shall be legal tender. But it appears that there are other forms of payment which are also valid that are not included in those listed above. A quote from the Uniform Commercial Code will illustrate this point. Subsection 2304, price payable in money, goods, realty, or otherwise. A, the price can be made payable in money or otherwise. If it is payable in whole or in part in goods, each party is a seller of the goods which he is to transfer. This quote makes it clear that we may discharge our debts in something other than money, goods, or realty. What could this mean? A quote from a Federal Reserve publication will shed some light on this question. Modern monetary systems have a fiat base, literally money by decree, with depository institutions acting as fiduciaries, creating obligations against themselves, with the fiat base acting in part as reserves. The decree appears on the currency notes. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. While no individual could refuse to accept such money for debt repayment, exchange contracts could easily be composed to thwart its use in everyday commerce. However, a forceful explanation as to why money is accepted is that the Federal Reserve government requires it. However, a forceful explanation as to why money is accepted is that the federal government requires it as payment for tax liabilities. Anticipation of the need to clear this debt creates a demand for the pure fiat dollar. Money, Credit, and Velocity Review, May 1982, Volume 64, Number 5, Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, page 25. The Federal Reserve is saying that the people could easily replace the use of Federal Reserve notes in daily life by using exchange contracts. This is amazing news. It means that we can use exchange contracts to discharge our debts. We will leave the discussion of what an exchange contract is and how it might be used for another essay. For now, let's turn our attention to what we currently use for money or call money. Federal Reserve notes. What is a note? Note, an instrument containing an express and absolute promise of signer, in other words, maker, to pay to a specified person or order or bearer a definite sum of money at a specified time. Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition. So a note is a promise to pay. The definition says that the note must be signed. If you look at a Federal Reserve note, you will notice there are two signatures, two witnesses promising to pay, the Treasurer of the United States and the Secretary of the Treasury. So a Federal Reserve note is a pledge on the part of the government to pay a debt. This means that a Federal Reserve note is a liability and not an asset. It means that every Federal Reserve note currency that is in circulation is actually a liability. Accounting. If our currency is a liability, then there must also be some assets to balance the books. So it is apparent that we need to understand some basic accounting first. Let's see first how accounting and account are defined. Accounting, an account or system of making up or settling accounts, a statement of account, or a debit and credit in financial transaction. Rendition of an account, either voluntarily or by order of a court. In the latter case, it imports a rendition of a judgment from the balance ascertained to be due. The term may include payment of the amount due. Major accounting methods are the cash basis and the accrual basis. Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition. Account, a detailed statement of the mutual demands and the nature of debit and credit between parties arising out of contract or some fiduciary relation. A statement in writing of debits and credits or of receipts and payments. A list of items of debits and credits with their respective dates. Any account with a bank, including a checking, time, interest, or saving account. Account means any right to payment for goods sold or leased or for services rendered, which is not evidenced by an instrument or shadow paper, whether or not it has been earned by performance. Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition. These definitions suggest that an account is something to keep track of, debits and credits, and accounting will be the practice of keeping track of debits and credits. Accounts are only needed when payment of goods and services are not made in full at the time of purchase. When you buy something on credit, house, credit card, car, an account is established to keep track of how much you owe. You open a checking account when you no longer want to pay for everything with cash. The checking account allows the bank to keep track of how much money you have. Black's 7th edition lists a number of different kinds of accounts, but for our purposes, there are 3 that are particularly interesting. A closed account, an account that no further credits or debits may be added to, but that remains open for adjustment and set off. Black's Law Dictionary, 7th edition. Offset account, one of 2 accounts that balance against each other and cancel each other out when the books are closed. Black's Law Dictionary, 7th edition. Open account, number 1, an unpaid or unsettled account. Number 2, an account that is left open for ongoing debit and credit entries and that has a fluctuating balance until each party finds it convenient to settle and close. Black's Law Dictionary, 7th edition. From these definitions, it becomes clear that so long as there is still activity occurring, an account remains open, but once all public activity, debit and credit has ceased, the account is closed. When you make the final payment on a loan, the account is closed. When you no longer need a checking account, you withdraw all the funds and close it. But a closed account remains open for 2 types of transactions, adjustments and set-offs. The idea of an offset account suggests that when 2 parties owe one another, set-offs can be used to cancel out opposing debts. The definition of set-off will give us another clue on how to use our exemption. Set-off. In the second sense, a debtor's right to reduce the amount of a debt by any sum the creditor owes the debtor, the counterbalancing sum owed by the creditor. Set-off signifies the subtraction or taking away of one demand from another opposite or cross demand, so as to distinguish the smaller demand and reduce the greater by the amount of the less. Black's Law Dictionary, 7th edition. It appears that if 2 parties owe one another opposing sums, a portion of the larger debt can be discharged by the amount of the smaller debt. The one who is owed the larger amount is called the creditor, and the one who owes a smaller amount is called the debtor. We have already seen that we are the creditor over the government, who is the debtor, and that it owes us vast sums. Since we are the creditor, it would appear that there should be some method of using what the government owes us to set off what we owe to other creditors. We have already been introduced to the concept of a bill of exchange. Various people and groups have researched how a bill of exchange and other instruments might be used to access our exemption in order to discharge our debts. They have discovered that these instruments can be effective. Our goal is to eventually discover how a man can use bills of exchange or other instruments to discharge all of his debts. The implications of such a discovery would be staggering. It would mean complete financial freedom for those who discover and learn to apply these principles. It is beyond the scope of this essay to cover the exact mechanism for using these instruments to discharge debts. Our purpose here was to demonstrate that we the people are the creditors and that the government owes us a huge debt, which we call our exemption. Another essay will cover exactly how to gain control over our straw man, and then we can see the mechanics of how to use our exemption. Spiritual applications. There's only one additional topic that we need to cover. This topic is only of interest to those of you who are spiritually and specifically those who are Christians. For these, we want to conclude this essay with a spiritual view of the material that we have covered. In chapter 2 of Genesis, we see a picture of an ideal existence where man lived in harmony with the Creator, God. In this setting, all of man's needs were met. Adam had an abundance of food. Genesis 2, 8-9. God had told Adam that he could eat any of the tree in the garden except the tree that was in the midst of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Genesis 2, 16 and 17. Adam did not have to work to make a living. There was not sickness, no disease, nor death, nor debt, and no taxes. There was not money because there was not debt, and there was no accounting system since there was no debt. All was right with the world. Then Adam disobeyed God and sinned. Genesis 3, verses 1-6. At this point, Adam and Eve recognized that they were naked. Verse 7. God covered their nakedness with sins of animals. Verse 21. This was not done without the shedding of blood, which gives us a clue into God's economy. This introduced the first debt into the world. God had already told Adam that if he ate of the one tree that he would die. So Adam owed God his life. Adam's sins disrupted the perfect fellowship he had enjoyed with God. The sin also disrupted the complete provision for his need that he had enjoyed. Adam was told that he would have to work by the sweat of his brow to meet his own needs. Verses 17 to 19. He was also removed from the provision and abundance of the garden, verse 23 to 24. As we reflect on these events, we see that mankind owed God the first debt. Adam's sin was the first debt that existed on earth. By extension, this means that all debt that exists derives from this debt to God. God is the original creditor, and all men are debtors under him. One of the great themes in the scriptures is the payment of this debt. As the story of God's relationship with man unfolds in the Old Testament, we see that God had an economy for the payment of debt that man owed him. God required the blood of animals to pay for sin. We get an early glimpse of this in Genesis 4, chapter 4, verses 3 through 5, and the offering of Abel and Cain. Abel's offering of blood was acceptable to God, but Cain's offering of fruit was not acceptable. Later in Genesis, we see that Abraham offered a ram to God, Genesis 22:13. Then in Leviticus, the understanding of God's economy for the payment of sins becomes very clear. In Leviticus 4, 1-35, detailed instructions are given about how the blood of animals would atone for sins. But Leviticus makes it clear that the blood of animals was only a temporary payment for sins. A single offering of blood would not atone for all future sin. Offering of blood had to be repeated often to cover new sin. But God had a better plan in mind. God's plan from the beginning of creation was to buy mankind back from his debt of sin. He had planned to offer the blood of his own son to buy us back from sin. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 19 to 20. The blood of Jesus was a payment that was far superior to the blood of animals. Jesus only had to offer up his blood once for all time. Hebrews 7:27, 9, 11, and 14, 10, 10, and 12, 10 through 12. Jesus had paid all the debt for all of our past sin and for any sin that we have yet to commit, that each of us owed to the Father. For those who accept the sacrifice of Jesus, all of your past debts to God are paid, and all of your future debts to God are prepaid. Not just spiritual debts, but economic as well. Remember that God was the original creditor and that all debt was owed to him. When the Father was paid in full by the sacrifice of the Son, all debts were paid for those who accept the sacrifice of Jesus on their behalf. Those who are in Christ have returned to a place of perfected fellowship with the Father. Jesus promises us that if we seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, that all of our needs will be met. Matthew 6:32-33. He also promised that he came so that when we may have and enjoy life in abundance. He also promised that he came so that we may have and enjoy life in abundance. John 10:10. Though Jesus was rich in heaven, yet for our sakes he became poor on earth so that through his poverty we might become rich. 2 Corinthians 8:9. The Father has promised to supply all that we need through the riches of glory, which are in Christ Jesus. Philippians 4:19. Jesus said to John that the sons are exempt. Matthew 17:24-27, which reminds us of our exemption. These verses do not remind us of lack, but of plenty and abundance. These promises are not for the sweat. These promises are not for the sweet by and by when we get to heaven. Therefore, here and now, while we are on this earth, it is my firm conviction that the death of Christ was spiritually placed. It is my firm conviction that the death of Christ has spiritually placed us back into the Garden of Eden with the Father. All of our needs are met, and we have an abundance to share with others. The sacrifice of Jesus is the spiritual foundation of the earthly reality of the exemption. Jesus has paid all our debts. In fact, our debts are prepaid. He supplies everything we need. We appropriate this provision and bounty by accepting the gift he offers us. This means that the exemption is a physical reflection of a spiritual reality. It also suggests that the exemption may well be God's provision to accomplish in the physical realm what Christ accomplished in the spiritual realm. At this point, we should explore bondage at a national level. In the Old Testament, we see multiple examples of a period of bondage lasting 70 years. The bondage was at a national level for rebelling against God. For example, the Israelites were in bondage in Egypt for 3 sets of 70 years or 210 years. There was another period of bondage for Israel in Babylon. This one also lasted for 70 years. Jeremiah 25:11. Daniel, the prophet, read the law and found that the people were supposed to be coming out of captivity. He prayed about it, and God sent an angel who told him he was right. When the 70 years in Babylon were fulfilled and the Jews were free, only a handful chose to leave captivity. Those who wanted to be free understood and applied the law and chose freedom. A more recent example of 70 years of bondage can be seen in Russia, which was enslaved to communism in 1917. 70 years later, in 1987, the communist bloc in Europe fell apart. You cannot keep a nation in compelled servitude longer than 70 years. Everyone in the Soviet Union did not leave slavery. We in this country have also been in a period of bondage for 70 years. I believe this bondage began no later than March 9th, 1933, when Congress passed the emergency banking legislation and later took the gold away. We are now in a time where we too can choose to be free. We can choose to embrace freedom principles and walk away from the bondage. The choice is yours. I pray that you will choose wisely. If you choose to be financially free, then we should also talk about the fact that freedom is found in Jesus. The scriptures tell us that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. 2 Corinthians 3:17. It also tells us to no longer take on the yoke of economic slavery. Galatians 5:1. It further instructs us not to turn our freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but rather serve our brothers. Galatians 5:13. The Apostle Peter warns us to not use our freedom for evil, but to continue as bondservants of Christ. These scriptures led us to some questions which I will ask you to prayerfully consider. If we can successfully use our exemption to discharge all of debts, then we have no need to work to earn a living. If that were true, then why should we work? The scripture is very clear about the need to work. The Old Testament says that man is under a curse because of our sin and that we must work to eat. Genesis 3:17-19. I believe that Jesus fully satisfied the requirement of the law under the Old Covenant. However, the New Testament, the covenant for those who are in Christ, said that if a man does not work, he should not eat. 2 Thessalonians 3:10. Thessalonians 3:10. I believe that even under the new covenant that we are commanded to work, but that leaves the question of what kind of work. There are two kinds of work. Work you do to be paid and work you do to serve others. If there's no need to work to be paid, since all your deeds can be met through the exemption, then we are free to work to serve others. What kind of service should we render to our brothers? What would you do with your life if you did not have to worry about earning money to support yourself and your family? What interests and desires has God placed within your heart? I believe God has created each one of us with unique gifts, abilities, and interests. I believe that we will be most fulfilled when we are doing the thing for which we were created. I would encourage you to begin a journey of discovery with God to learn what he has placed within you. Ask the Lord to show you what you are to do with your life and your time to serve him and others. Further study. We have not covered the exact mechanism of how to use the bill of exchange to discharge a debt, nor what must be done to get into a position to be able to use a bill of exchange. The next article that should be reviewed is entitled Redemption, which covers how to regain control of your straw man. Then you should study the article Using Your Exemption. And that concludes the exemption, people. And this is a document that you can find online. Thank you for your time, your patience, and understand this is just the beginning. We're going to keep coming with some good documents to read. And thank you for spending your time with me. Read along, study, look up the words. If you're not familiar with the words, look them up. This is how you better understand everything you're reading. You have to look up the definition of words. Very, very important. Peace and blessings, people. Peace and blessings.